questions. Question orale. L'honorable député de Mégantic.
The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Mr. Speaker, on Twitter, Facebook, or any other social media, there's a huge disinformation campaign on the situation in Ukraine. I get daily messages filled with falsehoods about the illegal invasion by Putin's regime. Too many Canadians are getting these messages, many of which repeat word for word what the Russian ambassador to Canada has said. In October, the Prime Minister said that disinformation was a threat to democracy. Why does the Prime Minister still tolerate Russia's chief propaganda officer in Canada, the Russian ambassador? Will he expel him, yes or no? The Honourable Minister of National Defence. Before I answer, I'd like to take this opportunity.
Andriy Burkovich, the Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of Ukraine to Canada. Welcome to the House of Commons.
I'll take this opportunity to remind the honourable members of the rules, but I'll let the minister go on with her answer.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We must defend Canadians against disinformation and propaganda. We will never tire. We will not be intimidated by tyrants who want to undermine our democracy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Mégantic-l'Érable.
Slava Ukraini, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, l'agression.
Mr. Speaker, the ongoing, continued illegal aggression of Ukraine by the Putin regime is a clear warning to the free world. According to National Defence, more than a third of our Army's equipment and vehicles are unserviceable. Our air capacity is limited. Former Liberal MP, Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Leslie, said that those who were telling us a few days ago that Russia wouldn't invade Ukraine are the same people telling us today that Russia will stop after taking Ukraine. Mr. Speaker, a simple question. Are we ready? The Honourable Minister of National Defence. Mr. Speaker, of course we're ready. We are neglecting nothing in bringing support to our Ukrainian friends, and to that end today I announced that we are intensifying further our support with two new significant contributions to provide more lethal aid. It's our priority to stand with the people of the Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Conservatives, of course, support every effort to aid Ukraine in their battle against the Russian invasion. And given Canada's very vocal support internationally, and given the threats issued by Putin and the Russian regime to punish those who try to stop them, Canada must be prepared for a worst-case scenario. This is the government's paramount responsibility, Mr. Speaker. So to the Defence Minister, I ask, what meetings has she had with Cabinet and her allied counterparts to prepare Canada in the event Russia acts on their threat and retaliates?
Good question.
Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président, merci pour.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the question.
Government is prepared for any eventuality. We are putting in across-the-board measures to support Ukraine in this situation. We have NORAD modernization as our priority. We are working very closely with our American counterparts, and we will leave no stone unturned for the safety and security of this country, this continent, and indeed Ukraine itself. Thank you, Mr. President.
The honourable member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, Russia has 40 nuclear-powered weaponized icebreakers. Do you want to know how many Canada has? 0. Russia has 18 military bases near Canada's Arctic border, whereas we are struggling to get one naval base up and running.
Shameful.
Yesterday, Russia's foreign affairs minister said, quote, "A third world war will be nuclear and it will be devastating." These remarks are deeply concerning and present a serious threat to our national security and public safety. So I'm asking the government, what measures are they taking this seriously, Mr. Speaker? I'm not quite convinced by the Minister of Defence answers. What meetings has she had to make sure we are prepared?
Yeah, great question.
Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to assure my honourable colleague and this House of Commons that we are indeed prepared for every eventuality, including the information that we have received relating to nuclear oversions that Mr. Putin has been making. I would like to say that we need to be non-provocative and we need to be rational in this situation, and we need to act together as a country and support each other in this time of need. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Mégantic-L'Érable.
Selon l'ancien lieutenant.
According to former Lieutenant Colonel and Liberal member, Mr. Speaker, deterrence will be what stops the Russians, and deterrence alone. The Russians have 18 military bases in the Arctic, and we have but one. Mr. Speaker, the Russian ambassador, who's the chief propaganda officer for Russia, is still here in Canada. What exactly is Canada doing to deter the Russians and the Putin regime from coming here to Canada? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to say that our government is very serious about protecting our northern sovereignty. What we are going to do, Mr. Speaker, is continue to work with the United States to defend our continent and our country as well. Mr. Speaker, we have the Coast Guard, and they are going to defend us.
Monsieur le Président, il y avait...
The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, 3 days ago there were 500,000 people who'd fled the war in Ukraine. Today there are 1 million. I welcome the efforts of the government with the emergency travel authorization, but more needs to be done and faster. The minister calls it an emergency travel authorization, but it will take 2 weeks to implement. After that, we don't know how long it'll take to process applications. With the number of refugees doubling so fast every 3 days, how long will it take before these people are actually in Canada? The Honourable Minister.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, today we announced a new program for people. It will reduce the red tape and accelerate the processing of applications from Ukrainian refugees for a period of 2 years. There is no limit to the number of people who can apply. This process will operate very quickly, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Saint-Jean. Mr. Speaker, Canada needs a large-scale air operation to get refugees here. We must be prepared to charter as many flights as possible to accommodate an influx of refugees that's swelling by 500,000 people every 3 days and could increase as Russian strikes become more brutal. The government has the support of the Bloc Québécois in its support for the Ukrainian people, but things have to go faster, especially since half of the refugees are children. Will the government organize this airlift? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, first of all, we will do everything we can to support Ukrainians. We will also, we know that some members of family members of Canadian citizens may want to begin a new life in Canada. All those arriving in Canada as part of these measures will be eligible for an open work visa and will be able to get to work quickly if they so desire. And we will work very hard for them and for their families.
Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, We need to stop the war in Ukraine. And to do that, we need to put pressure on President Putin where it counts, and that's his wealth. We know that his wealth is held in the hands of Russian oligarchs like Roman Abramovich. So will the Prime Minister commit to specific targeted sanctions to sanction the wealth and assets of these Russian oligarchs that's held in Canada?
The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Mr. Speaker. Let me just answer, Mr. Speaker. Together with our allies, we are ensuring that Russia's actions do not go unpunished. Who have we levied sanctions against, Mr. Speakers? President Putin directly, key members of his inner circle, his foreign minister, oligarchs close to the Putin regime, members of the State Duma, and we're not done yet, Mr. Speaker. We will keep working with our allies to impose sanctions that are meaningful across the board. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We must stop the war in Ukraine. And to do this, we have to put pressure on President Putin or on his wealth. We know his wealth is in the hands of Russian oligarchs like Roman Abramovich. Will the Prime Minister promise to freeze and seize the wealth of Russian oligarchs in Canada? The Honourable Minister of National Defence. Mr. Speaker, as I already said, we have already put sanctions on President Putin and the main members of his inner circle, the oligarchs close to his regime, and we will continue to put pressure, maximum pressure, on Putin's regime along with our allies. Thank you very much. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, in a February 2017 joint statement between the U.S. President and the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister committed to modernizing our equipment for NORAD. 5 years later, nothing's been done. The Prime Minister needs to wake up to the fact that Vladimir Putin is a danger to Canada, and right now we don't have the capacity to defend the far north. Will he keep his promise to modernize NORAD, or is that yet another promise he never meant to keep? The Honourable Minister of National Defence.
Alongside our American partners, our government is making the investments necessary to modernize NORAD. It is a personal priority for me and for our government, and I've had many conversations with the Secretary of Defense of the United States about our continued cooperation to protect the sovereignty of our Arctic, to protect our continental defense, and to work together for the benefit of the safety and security of our world. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. That's interesting, Mr. Speaker, because according to an April 2019 report of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, the committee was surprised to discover that Russian military forces had significantly bolstered their air and naval capabilities in the Arctic. Committee members said the North Warning System was at the end of its life, and they didn't understand why no funding had yet been provided for its replacement. The Prime Minister promised in 2017 to modernize NORAD, and in 2019, the committee recommended he provide the funding. It's now 2022. When will he do it? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, we are investing significantly. We're making key investments in personnel, equipment, and infrastructure in the north. What we have done, Mr. Speaker, is up till recently, just recently we granted a multi-million-dollar contract to NASA Corporation, an Inuit company, for the operation and maintenance of the North Warning System. We remain firm and unshakable in our defense of the Arctic, along with our international allies.
Rockies.
Mr. Speaker, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has taught us all that we can't take our own Canadian Arctic sovereignty for granted. Russia recently filed a claim that adds 705,000 square kilometers to Russia's current Arctic claims. From U of C Professor Robert Hubert, quote, "We haven't seen a country before that extended over its neighbors." Here's a situation where they're claiming the entire Canadian and Danish continental shelf as part of their continental shelf. When will this government stand up to Putin and defend our Arctic sovereignty?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And there is no situation that is stronger than our own sovereignty in this country, and Arctic sovereignty is an integral part of that. Canada's Arctic sovereignty is long-standing, well-established. We work with our partners in the Arctic Council to ensure that we will continue to exercise that sovereignty well. We are taking stands with our Arctic Council partners to ensure that Russia gets the message strongly. We will not attend meetings in Russia, and we will put a pause on all activity with Russia as we continue to defend Arctic sovereignty in Canada.
Honourable Member for Calgary Centre.
Mr. Speaker, with an aggressive Russian invasion of Ukraine, European countries recognize how dependent they are on Russian gas supplies. 40% of Europe's gas comes from Russia, and Europe's security now has a gun to its head. Coal plants are being brought back online, undoing years of progress on emission reductions. Energy and security analysts have been warning about this danger for years. The government has lacked Canadian vision on this matter. When will this government end its efforts to replace Canadian energy with offshore resources from hostile regimes?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the brutal invasion of Ukraine, European countries have very much made clear their decision to end dependence on Russian oil and gas. European countries have made it clear, including during this week's meeting of the International Energy Agency Ministerial, of the pressing need for Europe to accelerate the transition to renewables and hydrogen. We are conferring and working closely with our allies on short and long-term options for stabilizing and ensuring access to long-term energy supply. I am engaged directly with our American and European counterparts, and we are steadfast in our support for Ukraine and our European allies.
Well, Member for Calgary Centre.
An interesting approach, Mr. Speaker, but since this government came to power, Russia's natural gas exports have increased 35%, and Canada's exports have declined. The result, tens of billions of dollars have flowed to fund Putin's war machine. A decade ago, Canada had 14 LNG projects preparing to supply energy to an insecure world. Now, thanks to this government's aimless policies, none are built and only one is under construction. This is a choice with now obvious consequences. Will this government revise its regulatory regime to allow Canadian natural gas to get to Tidewater?
Yes.
Full Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've said earlier in the chamber this week, we have made the decision to ban the importation of all petroleum products from Russia. We are working actively with our European colleagues to ensure both short-term and long-term access to energy supplies. And we're working very, very proactively with the energy sector in this country, including with the Pathways Alliance, to ensure that we are producing our energy resources in a manner which is consistent with addressing the climate crisis.
The Honourable Member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Mr. Speaker, Ukrainians are fighting for their lives in a war financed by Russian energy exports. Dependence on Russian natural gas threatens Europe's energy security and fuels Putin's war machine. The world needs Canadian energy to displace conflict oil and gas now and for a peaceful future. Will the government agree today that an east-west energy corridor is vital not just for the Canadian economy, but for global energy security in a world where dictators like Putin can't finance war?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we and certainly European countries would agree that the dependence on Russian oil and gas is a significant problem for Europe that it must move to address. European ministers have made that commitment, including in the International Energy Agency Ministerial that I participated in earlier this week. We are working very actively with our European colleagues and with our American colleagues to ensure that we are working to help address both short and long-term energy supply issues in the context that Europe and Canada have committed to do, which is in the context of fighting both the crisis in Europe and the crisis of climate change.
The Honourable Member for Repentigny. The IPCC confirms that 3.5 billion people are highly vulnerable to climate change. And let's not forget that 70% of those living in precarious conditions are women. As March 8th approaches, I emphasize that women will be the main victims of climate change. This brings me back to what this government has done Tomorrow, the government will give an update on the Bay du Nord project and the 300 million barrels of oil it involves at minimum. Knowing the impact this decision will have on climate change and women, Bay du Nord, yes or no? The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our government fully recognizes the importance of the decision on the proposed Bay du Nord project. And as the member will know, we are following a legislated process. And Mr. Speaker, we are reviewing all the evidence, including the Impact Assessment Agency's environmental assessment report, in order to arrive at the best possible decision. And Mr. Speaker, I would assure the honourable member that that decision will be made in due course.
The honourable member for Repentigny. It was the Minister of Environment himself who announced that he would be giving an update on Bay du Nord on Friday. That's tomorrow, not 10 months from now. Normally, when you call the press for an announcement tomorrow, it's because you have something to say. And you know already, so I'll ask again. Bay du Nord and its 300 million barrels of oil in the middle of a climate crisis, is it yes or no? It's not complicated. The Honourable Minister.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, this is a decision that is under consideration as we speak. Mr. Speaker, we recognize the importance of a decision on this proposed project. We're following a legislated process, as I said, and it's going to be based on the best available scientific evidence. And importantly, we are considering the advice of the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, which the honourable member will know is independent.
The honourable member for Repentigny. You know what? The only environmental assessment the government should be concerned about is the IPCC's. The UN Secretary General says it's the most devastating scientific report he's seen in his life. That's a big deal. The government, the Deputy Prime Minister, the Parliamentary Secretary, they all say that their decisions are based on science. Well, here's what science says. There's no such thing as clean oil, and certainly not 300 million barrels of it. Science confirms that unbridled carbon pollution is driving the most vulnerable populations to destruction today and right now. So, Bay du Nord, yes or no? The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, do I have the floor, Mr. Speaker? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the honourable member has mentioned, the IPCC report shows that all countries need to take bold climate mitigation and adaptation action to fight climate change. We absolutely must continue to cut emissions and build resilience through our society. And that's why, Mr. Speaker, since we took office in 2015, our government has committed more than $100 billion to climate action, and we're developing Canada's first ever national adaptation strategy. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue leading the fight against climate change.
Member for Foothills.
Europe, Asia, Africa all rely on corn and wheat from Ukraine, the region's breadbasket. With Russia's invasion, a global food crisis is emerging. The United Nations has already warned of catastrophic hunger, and hundreds of millions are facing famine. Canada can help. We have a crippled supply chain, punishing carbon taxes, a looming rail strike, and PEI farmers are being forced to destroy millions of pounds of potatoes. In a global food crisis, when Canadian farmers want to help, why is this Liberal government neglecting Canadian agriculture?
The Honourable Minister for Development.
Mr. Speaker, at a time of crisis like this, I completely agree that Ukraine does supply the developing world with wheat. This crisis is going to be extremely serious. I have been at the UN speaking with the heads of the World Food Program and other organizations, and Canada can play a very important role in this. We'll work with our counterparts on how we can provide support for the developing nations at their time of need. Thank you.
Well, member for Charleswood St. James, Assiniboia Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, countless people in Ukraine are fleeing from ongoing Russian aggression. This is a major refugee crisis. Over 1 million people have fled Ukraine. Canada can be a safe haven. History demands that we act, and act now. Fast-track visas are simply not enough. On what date will the visa requirement be lifted?
Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for his question, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank my critics of all party for their spirit of collaboration and cooperation over the past number of days in advance of the announcement we made this morning. And that announcement is historic. It's going to remove many of the barriers that typically result in refusal so we can welcome as many Ukrainians fleeing this war as possible, as quickly as possible. But I would also point out to the honourable member that we started preparing on January 19th. And since the beginning of this year, more than 6,100 Ukrainians have already arrived in Canada, and we will continue to do more because that is the very Canadian thing to do.
The honourable member for Bellechasse, Les Etchemins, Lévis. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For decades now, Canada and Quebec have been home to a huge part of the Ukrainian diaspora. Ukrainians are hardworking people. 1 million have already fled into neighboring countries to escape the atrocities of war. Can the government show a bit of empathy and a bit of flexibility, which we've been calling for since February 17th? And let Ukrainians into Canada without visas as soon as possible, i.e. now. The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, Putin's war against Ukraine is a war on democracy. For a month now, we have been processing PR applications for Ukrainians, giving them priority processing. And we are extending their visas to stay. And today we made an announcement for Ukrainians fleeing the war to come to Canada more quickly and safely. It's a good thing for Ukrainians and for Canada.
Island Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, the cost of living is going through the roof, and yesterday the Bank of Canada raised interest rates. Paying rent, buying food, and medicine is seriously concerning for seniors. Some of the most vulnerable seniors have been anxiously waiting for months to get their GIS paid back. The government is doing the bare minimum to help people get by, and time is running out to fix the government's GIS mess. Will seniors be left out in the cold again because a Liberal government couldn't fix the problems they created?
Honourable Minister for Tourism.
Mr. Speaker, we know that seniors are hurting, and we have had the backs of Canadians throughout this pandemic. We know seniors that normally receive GIS payments are facing challenges today because they were supported by the CRB and CERB. In the economic and fiscal update, we presented our government's plan to alleviate financial hardship of GIS recipients who received CRB or the CERB. We will continue to investigate ways and respond to the needs of seniors, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Mr. Speaker, sanctions are one of the strongest tools we have to support Ukraine and deter Russia. This government has said it intends to block Russian ships from docking at Canadian ports, and we support this. But while they're ironing out the details, at least 4 Russian-owned vessels are bound for ports on our east coast. Dock workers have said they won't unload the cargo if it arrives. Will the government take decisive action to implement the ban now before dock workers are forced to do it themselves?
Minister for Transportation.
Mr. Speaker, our government stands with Ukraine and Ukrainian people, and we will not let the Russian aggression go unpunished. That's why our government took swift and decisive action to ban Russian flights from entering Canadian airspace. That's why our government took decisive and swift action to ban Russian ships from entering Canadian waters. Our government will do whatever it takes to stop the unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member for Mississauga, Streetsville.
Mr. Speaker, last December 16 and 17, Super Typhoon Rai, or Typhoon Odette, hit the Philippines. The typhoon caused significant devastation to communities, destroying homes and infrastructure, and took the lives in the Philippines. The impacts of this natural disaster are still being felt in communities in the Philippines almost 2 months later. Can the Minister of International Development tell us what Canada is doing to support the people of the Philippines? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of International Development.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the honourable member from Mississauga, Streetsville, who was also the first Filipina in this chamber as well. Today, I'm announcing that Canada will provide an additional $2 million in funding for life-saving humanitarian assistance to the Philippines to help the most vulnerable people affected by Typhoon Tai. This funding builds on the $3 million of humanitarian assistance announced last year that Canada provided to the Philippines. Mr. Speaker, our hearts go out to everyone impacted by this typhoon. Thank you.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Mr. Speaker, during the election, the Prime Minister was clear on his solutions to address out-of-control housing inflation. He said he was going to ban foreign ownership on homes in Canada. And yet, when the Member of Parliament from Simcoe North proposed to do just that at Finance Committee, the Liberals voted that amendment down. Is this Prime Minister only serious about giving young Canadian families a chance at home ownership when he needs their votes?
The Honourable Minister for Housing.
Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear on our commitment to implement a temporary ban on foreign buyers of non-recreational residential property. The member opposite knows very well that the amendment he's referring to was ruled out of order in the committee and would not have been enforceable even if it passed. We are committed to moving forward on this issue. If the member opposite and their party are serious about it, let them bring an amendment that can actually work, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Well, the committee heard the amendment and we voted on it, and that party voted it down. Now, we're only trying to get this Prime Minister to keep his promises, Mr. Speaker. Home prices have increased a gobsmacking 43% since 2019, and these Liberals only seem to pursue new ways to increase the price of housing and push people out of the market. Their latest scheme of mandatory energy labeling at the time of sale has been described as a crazy thing to do in the middle of a historic housing affordability crisis by the Ontario Real Estate Association. Mr. Speaker, when will the Liberals get serious about housing affordability for young Canadians and ditch this crazy new scheme of theirs?
The Honourable Minister.
I welcome the opportunity to set the record straight. You know who's not serious about housing affordability, Mr. Speaker? That party. They voted against the foreign vacancy tax. They voted against the first-time homebuyer incentive. They voted against investments in affordable housing. They voted against the Rapid Housing Initiative. They voted against the top-up to the Canada Housing Benefit. They voted against the National Housing Co-Investment Fund. They voted against Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lethbridge.
Marley came into my constituency office last week, tears in her eyes and her heating bill in her hand. She was worried because, you see, the price of living has skyrocketed, but her payment at work has not increased at all. She'll pay part of the bill, but she can't pay all of it. She'll have to make up for it next month, hopefully. But the problem is that she's doing this with every single one of her home bills. To make matters worse, the carbon tax is increasing by 25% on April 1st. My question is simple, while those across the aisle boo me for my question. And it is this: on behalf of Canadians, when will the punitive tax hikes be stopped?
The Honourable Minister for Tourism.
The opposition is raising the issue of affordability, so let's review what we've done since taking office. We lowered taxes for the middle class twice and raised them on the wealthiest 1%, and the Conservatives voted against. We created the CCB index to inflation, and the Conservatives voted against. We provided seniors with a 75-years-old one-time payment of $500, and guess what? The Conservatives voted against. This side will focus on affordability. That side should get on board.
The honourable member for Prince Albert.
It's nice to see some enthusiasm over there, Mr. Speaker. Canada's duty-free access to the U.S. market, our largest and most important trading partner, is under threat like never before. Tariffs on softwood lumber, punishing Buy American provisions, and now the possibility of highly integrated auto supply chains will be disrupted by more U.S. tariffs. In Tuesday's State of the Union address, President Biden stated, instead of relying on foreign supply chains, let's make it in America. That is code for protectionism. What is the minister doing to protect our lumber, auto, manufacturing workers from more U.S. trade restrictions?
Great question. Great question. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my honourable colleague for that important question. Let me start with a fact.
We have seen the highest trade between Canada and the U.S. than we have seen in our history of our trading relationship. That demonstrates that trade is working between our two countries. Of course, in a relationship as large as the one between Canada and the U.S., we have to continue to cultivate this relationship to the benefit of our workers and to our businesses. I was just there this Monday, just a few days ago, meeting with the USTR, with congressional leaders to continue to defend Canada and this really important market that we have access to.
The Honourable Member for Thérèse de Blainville. Mr. Speaker, in 2022, new mothers who lose their jobs at the end of their parental leave still have no access to EI. Even though 6 courageous women fought before the courts against the federal government to end this injustice, and even though they won, because Ottawa is appealing the ruling. Imagine, Mr. Speaker, the government is appealing so it can leave young mothers who have lost their jobs to fend for themselves. Will the government stop this appeal? The Minister. Mr. Speaker, this has shown that there are major injustices in our social system, and that is why the government is meeting with a number of partners across the country to better understand how we can reform EI so that it responds to the needs in workers, including mothers. The court is independent, and it has decided to appeal the decision. This does not change the commitment of our government in any way, and we will continue to work to reform the EI system. The Honourable Member for Shefford. Mr. Speaker, it's truly embarrassing. This is the week of March 8th. We are celebrating the rights of women, but that government is before the courts so it can keep the right to deprive young mothers who lose their jobs of EI, and it claims to be feminist. Think about it. It's unbelievable. Women had to sue the EI Commission because the government refused for years to fix this injustice. And even though they won, this government wants to appeal. How can this government imagine that it still needs to fight? Mr. Speaker, is this the type of fight a so-called feminist government should be engaging in? The Honourable Minister. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I said, we are talking about an independent court, and the EI Commission is also independent, and it is the one who made the decision. But we understand, Mr. Speaker, and we are working very hard to adapt and modernize the EI system so that it better meets the needs of all workers, including mothers.
The Honourable Member for Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
For 2 years, Canadians have been doing the hard work of getting themselves and each other through this pandemic. Saskatchewan and Alberta have done away with their mandates, with Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba, and the Atlantic provinces doing the same this month. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister is doubling down on mandates, and our allies around the world are moving on. No leadership and no plan. When will the Prime Minister end the mandates?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to receive this question from the member for Ontario. I'd like to signal that we've been working extremely hard, extremely well with Minister Elliott and the Ontario government over the last few months in order to protect the health and safety of Ontarians. Just to give an example, the vaccination operations that took place in Ontario probably saved thousands of lives and avoided billions of dollars in losses to families and businesses over the last few months. This is good news, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to work for the people of Ontario.
The Honourable Member for Leeds Grenville, Thousand Islands and Rideau Lakes.
Well, I'm glad to hear that the minister is delighted to get my question, and I'm glad to hear that he's been working with the province of Ontario. But on behalf of all Canadians, I would be delighted if this minister and this government would tell Canadians what their plan is to end the mandates. When is this government going to stop firing their public servants? When is this government going to stop moving backwards while the rest of the country and the provinces are moving ahead with less government restrictions and more individual responsibility? I'd be delighted to hear from this minister a plan to end the mandates.
Hear, hear. The Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the member is entirely right to talk about responsibility, both individual and collective responsibility. Individually speaking, I think most members of this House have been vaccinated, many of them with a booster shot, which is exactly the right thing to do. Collectively, we had, at least on this side of the House, and I think we worked collaboratively with opposition parties, a responsibility to protect everyone's health and safety, ending up with a large vaccination rate across the country, which are in fact the reasons for which we are able to get lockdowns away and to turn to more sustainability and affordability when it comes to moving through the crisis.
The honourable member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberals still require all incoming travelers to be tested for COVID-19, even for cross-border day trips by car. Now the Liberals have added another hammer. Canadians who drive home and do not present a negative COVID test are fined $5,000 or told to stay out of the country for 10 days. Wow. Ottawa is using financial penalties to keep Canadians out of their own country. Why does this government continue to punish Canadians with these mandates? And is this financial barrier to enter Canada even constitutional?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm delighted to be able to continue on this topic. The reason I mentioned earlier for which we're going through this crisis better and faster than many other countries is that Canadians have made the right choice. They were vaccinated in large numbers. That's why we are seeing large falls in the number of cases, large falls in the number of hospitalizations. The deaths are also decreasing, but that's not, Mr. Speaker, by chance. That's because Canadians have made the right choice and have been vaccinated and have followed public health measures.
The Honourable Member for Laval-Les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, this new bill seeking to modernize the Official Languages Act would never have come about without a great number of Canadians who participated, whether it be through individual meetings or hearings in committee. And we have also received letters and telephones, and so we are very grateful for the unbelievable participation of Canadians. Can the President of the Treasury Board explain to this House how she will ensure that this bill is respected? The Honourable President of the Treasury Board. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to thank my colleague for his question and especially his tireless work for his constituents in Laval-Les-Îles. The respect of the Official Languages Act is not only an obligation, but it is essential to be more effective in delivering our services to Canadians. Bill C-13, which modernized the Official Languages Act, will reinforce the official language powers of the Treasury Board to ensure the compliance of federal institutions. It will also ensure a heightened role of oversight, audit, and assessment. The right to work in French within the federal public service is and always will be non-negotiable.
Mr. Speaker, I'm concerned about the possibility of a work stoppage at CP Rail that would shut down supply chain across the country. CP Rail and the Teamsters have been negotiating, but strike action is possible as early as March 16th. Can the government tell us what steps they're taking to ensure that Canadians do not experience another supply chain crisis that will drive the cost of everything up even further?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Speaker, I want to thank my colleague for this important question. Our supply chains are critical for our economy, and I want to thank the workers of CP and CN and other organizations who have done the hard work during the pandemic, during climate events where we're there for Canadians. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, and assure my colleague, we are monitoring the situation. I met with the President, with the CEO of CP. I met with Teamsters. It's really important that we maintain the fluidity of our supply chain. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Bow River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just inflation is hurting small businesses in my riding. Chinridge Seeds is a bird seed producer in Taber, Alberta that relies on imported ingredients for their production. The cost of a single truckload of the ingredients went from $6,000 to $19,000 in a few months. The irrigation pipes went up by 30% that are critical. Don, the owner, told me this: we do not need handouts from the government. We just need them to get out of the way. So will this government stop their spending spree, get out of the way, let small businesses prosper, and the ball river riding? Hear, hear.
The Honourable Minister for Tourism.
Speaker, the pressures created by supply chain disruptions and the shift from buying services to buying goods are real, and we're monitoring that situation closely. Now, as it relates to inflation, there are other structural costs which makes life less affordable for Canadian families, and chief among them are housing and childcare, and that's why our government has a robust national housing strategy and a childcare plan that's covering Canadians from coast to coast to coast. The average Albertan family will save $5,600 this year.
The Honourable Member for King Vaughan.
Buongiorno, Signore Presidente. Maria, a single mom in my riding, has struggled for years to obtain a visitor's visa for her son, but IRCC told her he's not a priority. There are many Canadians like Maria being told seeing their family again is not a priority. They are left to suffer from IRCCS's long delays and backlogs. Can this minister tell us when they plan on clearing the backlog so that families can reunite in Canada?
The Honourable Minister.
I thank the honourable member for her question, and I'm pleased to share that over the past few months since I've been appointed minister, I've been working hard to advance investments that were actually going to have a meaningful impact on processing times. We've hired more than 500 new staff. We've invested more than $85 million. We've moved towards digital features that will boost the productivity of our department. And we've increased overall immigration levels. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to report that the combined impact of these investments have allowed us to approve over 100,000 permanent residency applications already in January and February alone. We're going to continue to make investments to improve processing times because Canadians.
For West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country.
Mr. Speaker, hundreds of First Nations across British Columbia rely on fishing as a primary source of revenue. Their success not only resonates in their community, Mr. Speaker, but across British Columbia. Could the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans please update this House on how the Pacific Integrated Commercial Fisheries Initiative is helping Indigenous commercial enterprises, including the Sechelt First Nation in my riding?
Well, Minister of Fisheries and Oceans.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleague from West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast, Sea to Sky Country for his question and his tireless work for his community. This funding initiative supports First Nations commercial fish-based enterprises right across British Columbia. Last week, our government announced $11.8 million to support business development and training for 31 Indigenous companies, representing 117 First Nations. We're committed to supporting First Nations in their work to create a thriving coastal economy.
The Honourable Member for Rosemont-La Petite Patrie. Mr. Speaker, the workers of the Auditor General's office have been on strike for over 3 months and without a labour contract for over 3 years. The absence and the silences of the President of the Treasury Board is not helping. As this strike drags on, impacts will be felt on the performance audits of this government in important areas such as emergency preparedness, cybersecurity, homelessness, and vaccination expenses. It's time for the Minister to step up. Will she finally act to ensure a fair contract for these professionals? The Honourable Minister of the President of the Treasury Board. Mr. Speaker, we are determined to reach agreements with all of these people that take into account the economic context. We are at the negotiating table, and the Auditor General's office is carrying out their own negotiations, and these complies with 99% of those of the Central Public Administration during the negotiating round in 2018. Thank you.
Kitchener Centre.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published their most recent report, described as an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. Yesterday, 126 environmental and citizens groups and academics called on the federal government to now reject Baie du Nord, a proposed massive new deep water oil drilling project owned by a foreign company looking to extract up to 1 billion barrels of oil, equivalent to running 100 coal-fired power plants for a year. A response is due Sunday. Will the minister commit to rejecting this climate disaster?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I shared with our bloc colleague a little earlier, we are following a legislated process on this very important decision. And Mr. Speaker, as I said, we're reviewing all the evidence, including the Impact Assessment Agency's environmental assessment report. I think the honourable member will be very happy to know our government conducts impact assessments using fair and predictable processes that are grounded in science and Indigenous traditional knowledge. And as I said, that decision will be made in due course.
I'm afraid that's all the time we have for question period today. I wish to draw the attention of members to the presence in our gallery of Mr. Andrei Bukovich, Chargé d'Affaires of the Embassy of the Ukraine of Canada.